Welcome to Proclaim. On today's video, we're going to address one of our viewers' questions, which basically is this. What does the restored gospel have to say or teach about the rapture or 7 years tribulation?
Proclaim the glory of the Lord.
Before we dive into answering this question, it's really important when we have discussions like this that we define what exactly we're talking about so that we can help to eliminate any possible confusion. So what exactly is the rapture? What do we mean when we say rapture? Well, the idea of rapture, which is really tied into also 7 years tribulation, is a relatively new concept or idea. Historically speaking, it was not taught throughout Christianity. And in fact, even today, most Christians do not adhere or believe in the rapture. But the idea basically came from the 1830s, which I find to be fascinating, as the restored gospel, or the church was restored in 1830. But anyway, it came from the 1830s, and it really extends from a scripture that Paul wrote in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18, where Paul basically explains the second coming of Christ, that there's going to be this trumpet that sounds, and then Christ is going to come, and those who were dead but follow Christ will be made alive, and those who are on the earth who are alive at his coming will go to meet them in the cloud, and they will remain with the Lord forever. And that's basically where the idea comes from. But it is interesting to note that the word rapture is not mentioned anywhere in Scripture, neither is it referred to in the Greek. When we're talking about the rapture, it's really important also to understand that there are lots of different views on the rapture and kind of the order of events. But the most popular one by far is basically before Jesus comes again, he's going to gather the righteous from the earth, and there will be then a time that will usher in a time of 7 years of tribulation, where basically the Antichrist will rule the world until Christ comes in his glory and set things straight. And so basically, this is the concept or the idea of rapture. So when we talk about it, this is what I mean. Now with that out of the way, we can dive in and we can answer the question, what does the restored gospel teach about the rapture or 7 years tribulation? And before I really kind of dig into some of the details, I would like to preface this with that this is a short video, and this really would take a lot more time to explain. And so I highly recommend you check out a series of classes that Elder Benji Pedersen taught, and I have a link to that below, where he goes into great depth and detail for all the things that I'm going to talk about and much, much more. And in fact, I'm hoping that we can get him on the channel and that he can expound a little bit more here on Proclaim. But in the meantime, it's important for us to understand that the idea of this rapture is really based on 3 principles, and that comes from Daniel chapter 9, 3 different sets of scripture in the New Testament where the disciples basically ask Jesus a series of questions, and you can find that in Matthew 24, in Mark 13, and in Luke 21. And then the final principle is built upon Revelation chapter 12, where it talks about the woman being hid in the wilderness for 1260 years. Now, with that being said, what does the restored gospel say about each of these principles? Well, if you go into a little bit more detail, you'll find that really the restored gospel shows that the idea of rapture and 7 years tribulation is not correct. It actually doesn't align with Scripture, and that these principles that I just mentioned are either misused or there is something that's missing that the restored gospel helps us to understand. For example, if you talk about, or you go and look at Matthew 24 and Mark 13 and Luke 21, if you look at the King James Version next to the inspired version, you're going to notice some pretty interesting differences. And perhaps the biggest one is simply the order of how Jesus answers the question. And that order of events really, it makes a difference in how we understand the last days. But to me, when I think of the idea of rapture and 7 years tribulation, it's really built upon Daniel chapter 9. The others are important, but really the core, the meat of it, is found in Daniel chapter 9. And when you read this, even regardless of the restored gospel, you'll find that that prophecy has already come to pass, and that Daniel chapter 9 was a prophecy on Jerusalem, not on the entire world. So what does the restored gospel say about this? So there is a tribulation that is going to come, but it doesn't preface a number of years. It doesn't say that there's going to be an antichrist that rules the world. Simply, we find in Genesis chapter 7 that before Zion comes, there will be a period of great tribulation. But during this time, the saints will not be removed from the earth, because this is the time of Zion. This is a time where a city will be prepared for the coming of Christ, a place of refuge, a place of safety where people can flee to. So we're not going to be removed from the world. We're supposed to be a light to the world, a city that's set on a hill that cannot be hid. So the idea that the saints or the righteous will be raptured away and will escape all tribulation is simply not accurate. And again, if you have more questions about this, please check out the link below to Benji's classes. But in the meantime, to conclude, the idea of rapture just isn't found in Scripture. The word isn't found anywhere in the Scripture. And what we mentioned earlier from 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, where Paul is explaining the second coming of Christ, we have an additional understanding, just a little bit more of the piece of the puzzle when we read section 85, verse 27, where yes, those who are alive at the time of Christ's coming, they will be caught up to meet Christ. But they're not going to remain there. They're going to come back down on the earth, for we know that the meek shall inherit the earth. So until next time, this is Andrew King, your fellow brother and companion in this journey we call life.